Dear respected Thai, dear brothers and sisters, dear friends, today is the 26th of November 2017. We are in the still water meditation hall of the Upper Hamlet, Plum Village. And we'll continue with the theme, the 7 factors of awakening, of enlightenment. I'm always really fascinated by this theme, enlightenment, because I feel that there's more than what I can see and what I can perceive and what I know. And I remember going through times in my life when I had this burning desire to know, to understand, because I feel there's a curtain that prevents me from seeing what's actually there. And this feeling, this desire was so strong when my mom passed away. I really wanted to know, where is she now? Which direction is she going into? And I felt if I could just draw away the curtain, I can really see. And yet it felt really impossible for me to draw that curtain so that I can actually see. So that I can really understand. And in my life as a practitioner, I felt a lot of time that I am wearing these tinted glasses to look at reality. I have an idea of reality. I have an idea, a perception of myself and of other people. And I can't really, really put down that glasses so that I can see reality as it is. And I can see other people as who they are, and not just ideas and perceptions and prejudices that I have. So a burning desire in me to really experience enlightenment, to really have a taste of it, because I know once I'm able to experience enlightenment, then I can see what my flesh eye cannot see. I can understand what my mind cannot perceive. And so I always talk about enlightenment. I always touch on it every time I give a talk. And one time, one of the younger brothers came up to me after my talk about enlightenment, and he said, "Sister, you were very brave to talk about enlightenment. And I knew that wasn't a compliment. And I asked, what do you mean? And he said, the brothers, or some of the brothers, are very allergic to the word enlightenment. And I thought, what's with you brothers? I mean, maybe that's why you have a lot of difficulties. Maybe because you don't set high enough goal for your practice. And that's when I realized that maybe people do have negative idea, negative connotation to the word enlightenment. And so the theme of the talks this winter is about enlightenment. How can we experience enlightenment here and now? What practices can we do to become enlightened? And so instead of using the word enlightenment, I learned to use the word awakening. I think it makes more sense to me because it's like we've been sleeping all along for 1,000,000 years with our eyes closed, even when we are awake. We live in a dream even when we are awake. And then all of a sudden, our eyes opened and we see. So it's a beautiful image for me. The word awakening really provokes that image of waking up to what's there. And so let me write down the 7 factors of awakening. Last week, Sister Gina had already talked about mindfulness. So the 7 factors of awakening, it starts with mindfulness. It's not dark enough, isn't it? The second one is investigation of phenomena or dharmas. The third one is diligent or energy. The fourth is joy. The fifth, it's tranquility. The sixth, it's concentration. And the seventh, equanimity. So today I will talk about investigation. So, as you have already learned, that there are the three important practices, 3 essential practices. We call them the 3 trainings, or the 3 learnings. It's mindfulness, concentration, and insight. These are 3 precious gems in our heart. And mindfulness simply means to know what's happening here and now. mindfulness is a light inside ourselves that when it's lit up, we can see. We can see not just with our eyes, but we can see with our mind. What's happening in our body, what's happening in our mind, and also what's happening around us. And like Sister Gina said, if only you take up this practice, the mindfulness practice, as she has shared last week, it's already enough for you to become enlightened. Because once you are embodied with mindfulness, you radiate with light. And that you can see so much more. And when you are mindful, it means that you're there, you're present for whatever that is you're looking at. And when you stay with it long enough, you see very deeply. And that's mindfulness, concentration and insight. And that seeing, it's coming from a very deep place inside. It's like a gut feeling experience. And once you have that insight, you know this is it. It's like aha. It's that aha experience. And it helps you to understand, and it liberates you from whatever it is that you still get stuck in, or that you have not understood. So that's mindfulness, concentration, and insight in brief. But when you look at the 7 factors of awakening, we don't really see insight. There's concentration, there's mindfulness, but there's no insight. I mean, insight is very important. It's the element that liberates. And it's not there. I can see in your faces that you have the answer already. And that's because investigation of dharmas, which means to look deeply, to search, to be curious, helps us to understand. So investigation leads to insight. So in investigation, if we practice it, then there's understanding, there's insight. So insight is actually there. But of course, if we practice mindfulness, you can also find insight in mindfulness. If you practice concentration, you can also find insight in concentration. Because these 3 things, mindfulness, concentration, and insight, they go together. Each is giving birth to the other. They are connected. And so, how do we practice investigation? How do we practice looking deeply? This is a question that came up all the time in my practice for myself, but also questions that came up from my younger brothers and sisters about how to practice looking deeply, how to practice the factor of awakening investigation. Is it speculation? Is it analyzing? Is it thinking over and over and over about something? Well, I'll share this morning how I practice investigation. Because since understanding is so important for me, that it's something that I've dwelt on a lot. Like I said, the biggest suffering for me is not understand, not knowing. Like seeing things through this window and not being able to get out of this window to see the whole picture. Because when I look at this window, this reality, it's just a tiny, teeny picture of the whole picture, a tiny bit, like one little jigsaw piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And only if I get out of this room, outside of this window, then I can see the whole picture. So let us look into the sutras to see what the Buddha say about investigation, how to practice investigation, to see whether it's really speculation and analysis, analyzing as we learned it, in school. To speculate things using our intellect, to analyze things using our intellect. So let's begin with the sutra on mindful breathing. We all know the practices of the sutra on mindful breathing. And it always begins, whatever it is that we're looking at, whether we're looking at our body, or our feeling, or our mind, or our perception, which is really the objects of mind, we always begin with breathing. So breathing in, I'm aware of my breathing, my body. Breathing out, I'm aware of my body. We start with breathing in, I'm aware of my breathing. Breathing out, I'm aware of my breathing. And so whether we're looking into the body, or whether we're looking into our feeling, or whether we look into impermanence, or the idea of non-self, we always have to dwell on the breath, which means we have to be present. which means no thinking. We have to stay present for the breathing with our body, with our breath, when we look deeply into something. And it makes so much sense because when we look deeply, while not using our breath, while we're not mindful or present, what happens is that we can easily get caught up in our thoughts, the stories we have in our head, ideas we have about, whatever it is that we're looking at. And before we know it, we're miles away from where we are, from the present moment. And so we can go in there with the intention, good intention of wanting to look deeply into something, and the next thing we knew, it's like we're wasting our time thinking about one thing to the next. Does that happen to you? Yeah. It happens to all of us because we're not really present. And so the breath helps us to stay afloat so that we're not submerged in the sea of thinking. So that's the first thing that we learn from the sutra, is that the breath is so instrumental in helping us to be able to look deeply into something. So let's breathe with the sound of the bell. And just stay present with the breath. We notice it coming in, coming out. We notice the beginning of the breath and the end of the breath. So the breathing helps us to be really quiet in our mind so that we can see. And then there's another sutra that I really like, and it's like my daily practice. It's the sutra, the Discourse on the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, which helps me to see how to practice looking deeply. And again, this discourse, the sutra, is shows us how to practice mindfulness in our body, in our feeling, in our mind, and in the object of mind. And What I really like about this sutra is that we don't have to do much. We don't have to do anything. That we simply acknowledge what's there. We acknowledge its presence, the presence of a feeling or of a mind state, such as anger or love. And we acknowledge that it's there. And if it's not there, we just acknowledge, oh, it's not there anymore. My mind, there is no hate in my mind. There's no love in my mind. That's all there is to it. It's a practice of recognition which is there. And what's, in other words, we just be present and be aware of what's happening in the body, in the mind, in the feeling, and in whatever it is that we're looking at. There's no judgment to it. There's no, associating this mental state with stories that we have or with experiences we had in the past. It's simply just mere recognition of what's there. So, what this says about looking deeply for me is that apart from being really present and mindful of my breath, I also need to keep myself really quiet. No thinking. In Zen, no mind, they call it no mind is Zen mind, which means no thinking is the Zen mind. And how is that possible? You may think, how is it possible that there's no thinking? I mean, we think all the time. Sometimes we're so drained without thinking, and we can't stop it. This ceaseless thinking. That's when the practice of mindfulness becomes really helpful to quiet down our mind. Being aware of the breath, being aware of the body, being aware of our steps. And that's why when we practice mindfulness, we are already practicing looking deeply. And I'm reading a book by Master Linchi, our patriarch. And, he uses really radical methods to help us cut off our thinking and to come in touch with our own Buddha nature. And I really enjoyed it, because for me, looking deeply is about cutting off our thinking. It's not speculation, it's not about intellectual speculation or analyzing. It's not about sitting there and think and think and think, even if you're just thinking about non-self or impermanence. Because the more you think, the more you become confused. The more we think, we are only coming in touch with our ideas and perception and preconceived ideas and notions. And we can't really experience reality as it is. We can't really see beyond this curtain. And so this comes to mind, the practice of stopping, arriving, and looking deeply. Stopping and looking deeply. These are two aspects of meditation. We stop, running in our head. We come back to the present moment. And then we see, we look deeply. And the metaphor that I really like is the metaphor of a pond. It's the image of a pond. A pond, on a windy day or a rainy day, when you look into a pond, you see lots of ripples and waves. You see fragments of what's there. You actually don't see anything. But on a still and clear day like today, you look into a pond and the water is so still and so calm. It reflects the blue sky. It reflects the white cloud. It reflects the tree in the water. It's as if they're like mirror image of one another. The image in the pond and also what's out there. And it's a metaphor for the mind because our mind it's like that. Whenever we have a lot of thinking and thoughts and ideas in our head, it's like it's full of ripples and waves. We can't see much. We're in the dark, actually, when we are just filled with so much thoughts, ceaseless thoughts. But when we are able to come back to our breath, come back to our body, come back to our steps, the pond of our mind becomes so still and so clear. We see so deeply into it. We see causes and conditions, why we are the way we are, why we feel the way we do, why we think the way we think. And that scene is not coming from up here. It's coming because our mind is clear. And Mr. Lynchie said, "You are already a Buddha. You don't need to look for the Buddha outside of yourself." And sometimes he shouts at you if you come to him with a lot of ideas and thinking to help you cut off all your thinking and, come in touch with your own Buddha nature, with the baby Buddha inside yourself. So I'd like to talk about where's actually this place that we can look for the Buddha inside ourselves. Since we're talking about, quieting our mind in order to see, where's that scene coming from? Where's that? Do you know where exactly that insight is coming from? So we know about the store consciousness, right? Maybe some of you may not have heard of it before, so I'm just going to say briefly about it. This is your mind. And in the depths of our being, our consciousness, our mind, there's different layers. In our tradition, we say about 8 layers in our mind. So the deepest of these 8 layers is called the store consciousness. And the store consciousness, it stores all kinds of seeds. And seeds are really potentials. Potentials that we're capable of. A whole spectrum of seeds. A whole spectrum of potentials. From the most positive to the most negative. In other words, we have the seed of a Buddha inside ourselves. The seed of insight in us also. But we also have the seed of ignorance, which is the seed of not seeing, not knowing, not understanding. And then we also have a seed of Mara inside ourselves. Mara is there in us too. In other words, everything that we're looking for, everything we have ever experienced, can be found right inside ourselves, in the depths of our being, in the store consciousness. It preserves all kinds of seeds. It maintains all the seeds in here. And then there are the 6 organs, sense organs. We have the 6 sense organs, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. These are the 6 organs. And when these 6 organs come in touch with its object, which is sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, or objects of mind, when these 2 things come together, it gives rise to an awareness, to a consciousness. So there's the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and the body consciousness, and then the mind consciousness. And so whatever it is that we come in touch with through our senses actually is a trigger that taps into the seeds in the depths of our store consciousness. It's a stimulus that triggers the seed inside. and this seed manifests as a mental formation, as a state of mind that we can actually experience in our body, in our mind. We can actually sense it, feel it, touch it. And so, whatever seeds that have been watered in us becomes significant. In other words, it affects the quality of our being. And that but we think that the object is coming from outside of ourselves, and it goes in and it taps into our seeds. And then, like this mental formation manifests. It's not like that. I mean, that's an image to help us to understand how store consciousness really works. But the store consciousness, it's the subject of knowing, but it's at the same time the object of knowing. These two things go together. They manifest together. What we feel, or what we experience, and what we see are manifesting together. So the subject and the object of cognition manifests at the same time. It is not something we take in. They are already there in a form of seeds. And so when they manifest as the subject and as the object. And this helps me. It helps me to see that I don't really need to go out there and look at things out there, to investigate on things out there. All I need to do is go back here in order to investigate what's inside of me. Because what is manifesting in me, what's manifesting out there is actually a projection of what's manifesting in me. Is that clear? Okay. And so for me, the object of my investigation is here. It's here. And that's why when you come to Plum Village, like all our practices, it's encouraging you to come back to yourself. The bell is helping us to come back, come back, come back. And Master Linji keeps saying, come back and recognize that the Buddha is inside. You don't need to look for the Buddha outside of you. And so it becomes really clear for me that the object of my investigation is myself. And it makes so much sense because when I understand myself, then I can understand other people. When I understand my impermanence, the impermanence of my body and mind, then I can understand the impermanence of everything there is. And what I really like about this is that I don't really have to, look for, I don't have to go out there to practice, that I have everything I need to practice mindfulness, to practice looking deeply. So go back, because you have everything you need to help you to understand reality. And the suffering we experience in our life, suffering, difficulties, the challenges we go through, they're actually really, really useful to help us to stop and look. And in my life, in my practice, I noticed that I went through times when I'm quite slacking. I may be, appearing, in the Sangha activity, but I'm actually really slacking inside. Because things are so easy. I feel peaceful, I feel calm, and I take it for granted. And it's only the challenges and the suffering that I experience that really pushes me to look a bit deeper. And so actually, it's good news to have suffering. And when you look at it in that way, suffering is not too bad. It's actually really good. There are opportunities. We always see suffering, when we experience suffering, that we see ourselves as being a victim. And that really weakens us. But when we see that suffering and difficulties are opportunities to have us go a bit deeper in ourselves to understand, then they're really, really valuable opportunities. That's why suffering is a noble truth, right? It's noble because it helps us to come in touch with reality, with who we really are. And we're more than just these difficulties. With the Buddha, we're not just Mara. We're the Buddhas too. And so these opportunities, the suffering helps us to come in touch with the Buddha inside ourselves and bring in her alive. And I'll share with you about how I prepared the Dharma talk, because I always have problem preparing for a Dharma talk. I really don't know how to prepare a Dharma talk. I notice my sisters coming up with a lot of paper and stuff like that, and I'm like, wow, that's great. I wish I could do that. And I try to think, and nothing comes to mind. That's my problem. And so what I did this time was that I know this is a really important topic, because, it's enlightenment. And so I asked my older sister, can you pretty please, give me some questions. What is it that you want me to talk about? What do you want to know about investigation? Give me some questions. And then I also told my mentee to give me some questions. And I told them a week before. And so they gave me all these questions. And what I did with this question was that I entrust this question in my store consciousness. I said, okay, take over. I'm not going to think, because I cannot think. And so that's all I did. And then I kept really quiet. In my daily activity, I do my best to be mindful. and to be really conscious of what's unfolding inside. And then, boop, 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 boop. Like this idea comes up, even when I'm least expected, like what I should say and how I should say it. Not how I should say it, because I never know how I should say it. Whatever comes, comes. It's coming in touch with everyone that trigger whatever it is that had come out. And this is what I do in my daily life, is that I have to trust my store consciousness. And when we are keeping ourselves really quiet, really mindful, to reflect on what's there, this is exactly what we're doing. We're entrusting the store consciousness with these issues for it to work for us. And it's actually less costly, because that's the nature of store consciousness, is that it works night and day, even when we are asleep. Maybe when I'm asleep, like these questions working in the depths of my store consciousness to prepare the Dharma talk for me. It's very costly when we have to think, because our brain weighs only 2% of the whole total body mass, and it consumes 25% of the energy of our whole body. But if we are like having this episode of like ceaseless thinking, that we couldn't stop, even when we are completely exhausted, even when we have like a terrible headache and we couldn't stop thinking. Anybody ever experienced that before? No, a few of you only? Wow. That happened to me. So I know, I've been there. And so it drains you. And yet you're still in the dark, because the more you think, the more in the dark you are. But if you entrust these issues to your store consciousness, like I have entrusted these questions in the store consciousness, the store consciousness would do its work, and it will provide us with the answer. And that answer is insight. So insight is not coming from our head. Insight is coming from the depths of our being. So trusting in my store consciousness helps me not to be so tired and not so drained. So the practice is not about getting more. The practice is about clearing away. Because we already have whatever it is that we're looking for. We already have insight inside ourselves. It's about clearing away these ideas and thoughts and perceptions and thinking that there's space and room for this insight to unfold. So one inevitable question that came from my sisters is, how do I give an example? Or how do I practice looking deeply to work through my suffering? Do you know, I've been up here many times before. In the last more than 3 years. Do you know that before that, Thai was always up here, and we have the pleasure of just sitting down there and listen. Do you know, being up here, it's kind of, I feel transparent up here. Because it's beyond me what actually comes out. And sometimes my sister said, it's a good talk, or sometimes it's not a very good talk. And I said, I'm sorry, whatever comes out, you just have to accept. Because I can't do anything about it. It's my store consciousness. I blame it on my store consciousness. And, but this time, I have to admit, I'm a bit nervous to come up here. I had to breathe with that feeling. And I heard this voice underneath that feeling of nervousness. It's a voice that I'm not good enough. Is that voice familiar? I'm not good enough. And this voice, it's really a very old friend of mine. A voice that was there when I was a child, and especially when I was a teenager. And I had to work a lot with that voice, that I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough at everything. Do you know? I'm not intelligent enough, I'm not beautiful enough, I'm not enough of this, and I'm not enough of that. And I had to work a lot with that when I began my life, my practice. And what I realized was that voice was actually connected. I don't know if it's connected, but it has to do with my dad. And I never talk about my dad in the community. I talk a lot about my mom, but never about my dad. And that's because I don't know what it's like to have a dad. And that's because my dad passed away when I was 1.5 years old. And I grew up feeling there's something wrong with me, that I'm not complete, that I'm not good enough, that I'm not good enough. And that as a teenager, as a child, I feel like there's a hole inside here. Even though my mom was a very loving, caring, she was never remarried, so that she can really put all her energy and her love for us. And that was the internal process that was happening inside. It's as if there's a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle inside me. And it created a lot of suffering for me. And in my practice, whenever I experience suffering, it's always coming back to that suffering as a child, as a teenager. And that voice have always been there. And I have to work a lot with it. And so when I knew this is where it was coming from, I practiced to accept myself as who I was. And I practiced to see my father in myself, to see my dad in myself. And I start to notice things in my siblings that are also in me. It may not be very strong in my mom. I know that's my dad. So with the practice, I was able to fill up that hole. The practice of understanding myself, the practice of accepting and loving myself as who I am. But then, once in a blue, it comes up again. Like this voice, it comes up again. But the practice of looking deeply had helped me now to recognize it immediately once it comes up, so that it doesn't have the charge and the power to overwhelm me as it had, as a teenager. And so, whatever it is that we have to work with, whatever voice it is that's keep telling us about ourselves, it's actually a wrong perception of ourselves. If we look deeper into ourselves, we see that we're more than just this voice. And that can help to fill up that hole in our soul. It makes us feel complete. So, whatever it is that you're experiencing could be the object of your investigation. And that's where we need to start. And so investigation really is a practice of listening to ourselves, listening to this voice inside. And I realize that we don't do this very often. When we have like a quiet time, a quiet place, with ourselves, we see that there's so much thoughts, thinking, and ideas. But if we can just listen to those thoughts and ideas, like this very soft voice inside, it's like there's like a chattering box in the back of our head. We can actually understand ourselves a lot and a lot and a lot. And it could be really healing to be able to understand, to be able to listen to that voice. It helps us to understand ourselves and why we are the way we are, why we suffer the way we do, why we get triggered the way we do. So awakening or enlightenment, it's not something beyond us. And they're not just ideas either. Whatever ideas that brother had about enlightenment, it's not about that either. It's about our daily experience of living mindfully and of being still enough inside ourselves that we could see deeply into ourselves. And we're coming a bit closer to the reality of who we really are. That we can come a bit closer to the reality of who that person really is and what it is that we're looking at. So enlightenment is possible. And it's simple to do it, simple to experience it. And it starts with this breath, mindful breath, mindful steps. There's this, some people say that Thai only teaches breathing in and breathing out. But if you can really practice breathing in, breathing out deeply, you can experience enlightenment, awakening right here, right now. So thank you for embarking on this journey with all of us here in Plum Village. A journey to wake up, to become enlightened. And that with every step we make, every breath we take, we experience enlightenment. Thank you for listening.